This is the Cutty Sark. Well, a model of it. It's not this small. She was built in 1869 and is one of the last, if not the last, of the T-clipper ships. She's currently preserved as a museum ship near the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England, and we actually had the privilege of touring her about a year ago. Despite seeming antiquated, clipper ships, especially the Cutty Sark, were extremely fast, and they gave the steamships of her day a run for their money. The White Star Line, as it existed from 1845 to 1868 when it was bought by Thomas Ismay a year before the Cutty Sark was launched, was as a company that primarily chartered sailing ships. They owned some of their own sailing ships and they actually had a couple steamships as well, but it was primarily sailing ships running charters between North America, Europe, Australia, and South America. This was known worldwide, not just for the White Star Line, as the golden age of sail. And one of the largest shipbuilding cities in North America was St. John, New Brunswick. And actually, in digging, we found that St. John, through the early White Star Line, has quite a number of White Star Line connections that most people didn't know about. Some of the most iconic early White Star Line sailing ships were built in St. John. So let's explore that history a little bit while also exploring St. John, New Brunswick. This is St. John, New Brunswick, and it is one hell of a city. I'd been wanting to come here for a while, but I was struggling to figure out a way to connect it to the Titanic. There's only really one minor connection to the Titanic, and we'll be covering it. But then I dug deeper into the early White Star Line history prior to Ismay's purchase in 1869-1870. And if you look before that, to the first incarnation of the White Star Line, when they were chartering all these different clipper ships and running the Australian routes and going across the Atlantic with chartered ships, St. John has a very rich involvement with the White Star Line. So you guys know me, I'm Tom Linsky, but this is
Joshua Thompson.
Who are you, Josh? I know you, but they don't know you.
Well, I'm a born and raised St. Johner. Invested a lot of time in learning about local heritage and our position in the world in terms of shipbuilding history with the Loyalists after the American Revolution, and also our Irish heritage. Tom and I met last year at the Halifax Convention. It's kind of been since then that this whole idea of learning more about the White Star Line and its early connections to St. John Shipbuilding arose. So it's been an educational experience for me, to say the least. So I find that the Titanic history that I was able to learn about through Halifax has tied in really nicely. I've been able to find little connections here and there, so it's been really cool.
And we're both board members with the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada, so I messaged him on Facebook. I said, I want to make this video. And he says, why don't you come on out, we'll make it together. And I got a great place for you to stay. And we're here in the Chipman Hill Suites. And they were extremely hospitable and gracious about me coming in. They gave me a great room, a nice mug. And the building itself, going back to the late 1800s, beautifully built. The craftsmanship of this building really reflects the craftsmanship that went into those early White Star Line chartered ships. Behind me is a 1/3 scale replica of the Marco Polo. The Marco Polo was the most famous tall ship from the golden age of sail in Canada. Now, did you know that the Marco Polo and the Titanic have a very unique connection? The Marco Polo was operated by the New Liverpool line of Australian packets, owned by Pilkington, Wilson, and Baines. Pilkington and Wilson were the White Star Line, the first incarnation of the White Star Line. They founded it. They chartered a lot of different ships, including the Marco Polo behind me. And in the 1860s, they were bought out by Bruce Ismay's father, Thomas Ismay, and later the White Star Line would own and operate the infamous RMS Titanic.
Hi, my name's Barry Ogden. I'm the originator of the Marco Polo project, which is building a replica of the fastest ship in the world. I'm here in St. John, New Brunswick, where the Marco Polo was built. She sailed for 32 years, from 1851 to 1883, and most tall ships sailed for 10 years. So she's a great testament to shipbuilding here in St. John, which was 4th in the world. I first proposed the building of a replica of the Marco Polo in my 20s, and we started the idea with a steel hull Marco Polo of full size. because the wood does not exist anymore. So anyway, that wasn't possible. We did work out all the details how to build it because they didn't have blueprints at the time, and that took us a couple of years. And that was all donated. That was worth about $500,000 worth of work, but it gave us something to work from. And we had to collect logs and diaries from Melbourne, Liverpool. The lines are stored at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So when that didn't work, and the government did some studies on it, one of the people in the government came along and said, it's got a sail. And I said, if you're going to make it sail, you're going to go from $3 million to $30 million overnight, because the laws in Canada will not allow this to sail. So that really set us back. So then I got thinking, what else could we do? And then I thought, well, why don't we build a smaller replica? The whole community came together and we raised the money, a lot of gifts in kind, and volunteerism. And it took us about 4 years. We built it inside a shed here, and then this has been sitting here for 5 years. And we would love to find a home for it. And so we're at the point now where we're going to be moving it from the port out to East St. John across the Harbour Bridge. And then from there we're talking to a developer about making it the key part of a development in East St. John. The story starts really with shipbuilding with the Loyalists who came from the New York, Philadelphia area. And a lot of them had shipbuilding skills and such. They started their lives over after losing everything. And then a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte came along, and his biggest fear was the British Navy. And the British got their lumber from Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and he developed the Continental policy, which cut the British off. So they started to come here, and we grew very quickly. James Smith came here after his parents were in the Napoleonic Wars, and he started a shipyard, and he built the Marco Polo. He took the clipper lines and a drogger, which is square in the midships, and he combined the two. So the Marco Polo is a very unique vessel. And in those days, they didn't have blueprints or anything, so you can imagine what it was being built like. When she was about to be launched, she fell over on her side in Marsh Creek. A lot of people thought that because she developed a hog or a swell, that was the reason for her speed. It's a little bit of a romantic idea, but she was just so well built. She had 10 different captains. The first captain was William Thomas of St. John. He was 26 years old, and we have the captain's papers. They were issued by the St. John Board of Trade in 1850. And then she had several other captains, but she went across the Atlantic in a record 14 days or something. But it was the trip from Liverpool, England to Melbourne, Australia and back, and circling the whole world, going around Cape Horn and Cape of Good Hope, both in South America and Africa, where she set her world record. And the captain at the time was James Nicole Forbes, Bully Forbes from Scotland. In later years, she went from being a timber carrier to a passenger carrier. She could carry about 1,000 immigrants to Australia. And there'd be today millions of people in Australia who trace the roots to it.
What year did she go down?
In July 1883 at Cavendish, and that's where she is today. She's a national historic site, and she cannot be touched. The wreck is protected at a national park at Cavendish. It was the fastest ship in the world. It was extremely well built, being 32 years. And it helped put us on the map. We were the 4th largest shipbuilder in the world, and it set records. And to me, it's a story of who we are, because we are still a major port city. We still reach out to the world. To me, it creates that sense of pride of who we are. And of course, if you don't have pride in who you are as a society or as a culture, you really will never move ahead. And we here in St. John have been having tough times in the last few years. So it's important for us to know our story, all of it. And this is a key part of our story.
Hi, my name is Stephen Mott. I'm an interpreter at the New Brunswick Museum here in St. John, New Brunswick. We're in the shipbuilding gallery in the New Brunswick Museum, where the lost industry of wooden shipbuilding is celebrated and honored. And of course, we have all sorts of different artifacts from the New Brunswick Museum's collection that really give a good idea of the relevance and the importance of the shipbuilding industry for New Brunswickers in the mid-19th century. In the heyday of the shipbuilding industry in the 1880s or so, in St. John alone there were 24 independent shipyards. Thomas Hilliard Shipyard being one of the more productive shipyards, and a lot of the smaller shipyards that were established were eventually absorbed by larger shipyards, and so that the industry really did come to an apex in the 1880s, 1890s, before of course the metal hulls took over from this wooden craft. This great model here in the diorama gives us a sense of what exactly was going on in the Marsh Creek area of St. John and the golden age of shipbuilding. We feature front and center, of course, the very famous Marco Polo. If we can have a close look, we can see all of the flurry of activity, the workers with the volume of lumber required in the construction of these ships. We also get a sense too to appreciate the scale of the endeavor it would be to build one of these ships, as of course even the houses are dwarfed by the sheer size of the Marco Polo.
These two shipbuilders are right next to each other. There's only a tiny little wooden fence separating them from each other. It's very easy to miss in this model, but that's the division between these two shipbuilders.
So we're outside one of the cases with a model featuring the Marco Polo, and if you notice around the case there are some artifacts that have been recovered from the wreck. So after about a career of 30 or so years, Marco Polo did meet her end, as so many of these wooden ships did. And so these objects, the telescope, we have a dinner bell, very important, you don't want to miss a meal. And these objects were recovered from the wreck of the Marco Polo in the 1960s. Perhaps most impressively, however, is this anchor behind me here, which, although it has the appearance of wood, that's the result of all of the saltwater corrosion and rust. And of course, behind me, we have one of the decorative touches that is, of course, a very important part of so many of these ships, and this is a stern carving. A little bit different from the figurehead at the front, so these stern carvings were another little added touch that made ships identifiable. This received a lot of conservation treatment when it was recovered from the wreck of the Marco Polo, and that's a big part of what certainly the Brunswick Museum's mandate is, to conserve a lot of the pieces in the collection to be able to relay the stories for generations to come.
Now this is James Smith right there, right?
Yes, the portrait of the man behind the Marco Polo himself, Mr. James Smith. And you can see there's a ship in the background just above his right hand, and of course we say that's the Marco Polo. Hard to say for sure though. Happy to celebrate the story of the Marco Polo and of course all of the shipbuilding industry in New Brunswick and the Maritime Provinces even here at the New Brunswick Museum. And I encourage you all to come visit us and have a look at some of our wonderful collection that celebrates this glorious industry of the past.
We learned in the New Brunswick Museum that James Smith Shipbuilder was immediately adjacent to the Wright Shipbuilder. Now we know that James Smith was approximately right there, and now we suspect that the Wright Shipbuilder was just about here on this creek. So right now we are standing where the Bijapur, the David Cannon, the Ann Wilson, the Empire of Peace, and the White Star were all built, and right there is where the Marco Polo was built. As I said earlier, this spot, the Wright Shipbuilders, seems to have been the White Star Line's shipbuilder of choice, at least in North America. This is where they got a lot of their ships, including their flagship, the White Star. In a way, this is the forgotten and lost equivalent to Harland and Wolff. That's where we're standing. Now, these were, of course, much smaller ships made of wood. Much smaller, much lighter, and much less expensive. But still, this right here is the equivalent to the early Harland and Wolff for the White Star Line, the first incarnation of the White Star Line. That's really something, and there's no sign of it. There's nothing here to indicate that except for that little street sign right there that just says the Marco Polo. But the White Star Line connection is completely gone. Now, what, like 2-3 decades ago, they did a landfill here, they built a causeway, and they did all sorts of rerouting of this creek and changed the landscape topography entirely. So this probably was not a creek back in the 1850s and 60s. This was probably solid land. The creek probably ran somewhere else.
If you can visualize taking out the landfill, modern obstructions, and picture looking straight out to Courtney Bay and the Bay of Fundy beyond, that was a massive area to work with. So again, that just shows the mass distribution of ships that was going on here. I mean, we're talking like that's a huge area.
Yeah. I have to say that without that diorama in the museum, I don't think I'd be able to visualize this. It's so foreign to what is here now. But that model there was fantastic. And now I can see the slipway, and I can see the buildings there, and the ships being raised up from the keel. So we would have had the slipways coming down from Wright and from Smith and any other of the perhaps many shipbuilders that might have been along this strip right here. There would have been little warehouses, most of the time made out of wood, where you would have they would have carved out the pieces. They would have done the elaborate woodworking on the carvings and the engravings. They would have had probably a sail shop. They would have had a whole number of different things, a rope works. Although it's quite likely that shipbuilders like this might have outsourced sail construction and rope works and then imported that in. As an archaeologist, I'm wondering what's under all this land. I mean, there's no way to get to it. You'd have to dig through tons of it and sift through it. You wouldn't ever be able to find anything. And what's probably here is not worth it. You might find hammers and saws and things like that, but I really don't think you're going to find anything of significance. All the good stuff left with the ships. But I do wonder what is actually here. Would you be able to find pieces of old ships that were scrapped, or some of the old tools? But that's all lost. That's all lost. So not only visualizing the site where they built it, I'm kind of admiring this uphill view we get of the rest of the city. Of course, it's blocked off by all these hideous modern buildings, but the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception is there. And that was built in the 1850s, you said.
Yes.
And that would have been here when they were building the White Star, the Marco Polo. As they're raising these ships up, you could look up and see that spire there. That's incredible. And that probably would have been one of the first churches called the Immaculate Conception, because I think the Immaculate Conception was declared in the 1850s. So that might have been one of the first ones. Right across the street from the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception is Fitzpatrick Funeral Home.
A connection that Fitzpatrick's has to the Titanic story is after the disaster, Fitzpatrick's went to Halifax to assist especially Snow's funeral home with the aftermath, with the embalmings and the funeral services.
Among the undertakers that were sent out to Halifax to work with Titanic's dead was the only woman of all the undertakers. Of the, I think 40 or 50 undertakers went, she was the only woman who went. She was tasked with the embalming of the female victims of the Titanic, as well as the unknown child. So the unknown child was embalmed by the undertaker who worked here. It was all done in Halifax, but she came from this funeral home.
So it's to me that's a special connection to my hometown with the Titanic story. Fitzpatrick's was a prominent funeral home in St. John for over 100 years. It was just a couple of years ago that it was donated to the Outflow Men's Shelter. And of course, Fitzpatrick's were always known for helping the community and bringing people together in their time of need. And I find it quite special that in the end they donated it to an organization that helped people and still does to this day.
So being in New Brunswick, we fall into the Atlantic Canada region. Being board members of the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada, this really falls under that, and I want to encourage you all to check out the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada's website below. Check that out, consider a membership, and I want to give a quick thank you to the Chipman Hill Suites, which so kindly welcomed me, and the New Brunswick Museum down at the waterfront, as well as the Marco Polo project. Thank you to everyone in the wonderful city of St. John, New Brunswick for welcoming Emma and I for a couple nights. Thank you.